Okay, now it's time to head to the second issue in the case. Just as a brief reminder, the first thing that Maryland argued as a method, the first argument that they thought the bank was unconstitutional because of was that Congress didn't have the power to create a bank. Marshall's finished answering that question. No, Congress does have the power to create a bank. Here's Maryland's fallback argument. Look, um, fine, the federal government can create a bank. The state of Maryland is also allowed to tax it. Um, and the argument is that taxation is a shared power. The federal government raises money through taxes, and so do the states. And so, in fact, both are allowed to tax not just individual people, but corporations. Um, so they said, like, why should our state's ability to tax an institution be limited in this one example? And Marshall's response is actually the Constitution does limit state taxing power in certain instances. State governments don't have an unlimited right to tax. And we go back to this same part of the Constitution again about state government employees taking care of looking at goods that are coming in and out of port cities. And they can charge a tax on those goods, but only to the extent that they are absolutely necessary to fund the people who are carrying out the inspections of cargo. So there is at least an idea out there directly in the Constitution that state government's abilities to tax are limited, and number two, they're limited in a way so that the federal government, that the state doesn't undermine the federal government while doing so. Um, Maryland, part of the reason why they think that they should have the reason to tax in whatever way they want, whatever institutions that they want, is that at the end of the day, it's not like we shouldn't be looking to Congress and their ability to succeed. We should be looking to the states because the states are the ones who are responsible for the Constitution existing to begin with. And Marshall is like, yeah, no. The states aren't the reason why the Constitution exists. We, the people, are. And the way he phrases it is consider that instrument. Now let's pause here. This is very important for you to understand the ye old timey writing in some of these cases. When you come across the word instrument, it means the U.S. Constitution. So make sure you write that down. It'll really help with your studies. So consider that instrument not as emanating from the people, but as the act of sovereign and independent states. That's Maryland's argument. Oops, sorry. That the Constitution doesn't owe its existence to the people. It owes its existence to each state being completely in charge and independent of each other. And so basically the Constitution is an alliance of different states in the same way the European Union is an alliance of different countries in Europe. So as a result, the Maryland's argument is that the powers of the general government, so here another Marshall translation guide, general government means federal government. So Maryland's argument is that the powers of the federal government, it has been said, are delegated by the states who alone are truly sovereign. The states are in charge. But by a sort of like the Constitution being a treaty, they've agreed to surrender some of their powers to this new higher level institution in the hopes that creating a federal government will serve their interests as states. And Marshall's like, yeah, no, that's not what happened. The instrument was submitted to the people. And here what he's saying is, yes, the Constitution needed to be ratified in 3/4 of the states before it would take effect and overtake the Articles of Confederation as our new governing document. Yes, it looks like that the way that the Constitution was ratified after it was written is like, does, this state sign off? Does this state sign off? And they go ahead and ratify the Constitution. And Marshall says, no, actually, the Constitution's instructions were that this Constitution will take effect when the people of at least 9 of the original 13 states have ratified it. The Constitution said that you have to hold elections to choose delegates to go to your state's capital and debate whether or not we should adopt this Constitution. And everyone knew when you walked into that special election to elect convention delegates, that if you vote for, Smith and Jones to be your 2 delegates, Smith and Jones are both pro-Constitution. And so if you elect them, they're going to go to that convention and they're going to vote in favor of the Constitution. Now, if you instead choose to vote for, two other people, Miller and Johnson, right? Those 2 leaders in your state are on the record as being against the Constitution. So if you cast your 2 votes for delegate to them, you're effectively ensuring that the Constitution fails. So the argument here is that the way the Constitution contained instructions for it to take effect after it had been written was basically like a national referendum. That where the people would hold special, each state would hold special elections for delegates to a convention, but the people knew that if you checked this box, you were ratifying the Constitution. If you voted for someone else by checking a different box, you were effectively voting no on the Constitution. So that's why we can know that it's not we the states, it's we the people. So that's the first argument. That's just this part, right? Then, if you look to the preamble, it was not ordained and established to help the states. The preamble of the Constitution says that this document was ordained and established in the name of we the people. Okay, so here's another structuralist argument. Again, understanding Marshall and structuralism is really, really important to succeed in this course. So here's the basic argument is it looks as though Maryland can tax the Bank of the United States because, in general, state governments have the right to tax financial institutions. However, if we understand that what Congress is trying to do is to act successfully, it must be able to not only have the ability to choose a bank as its preferred strategy, but have that bank operate without state governments trying to undercut it. One state can't undermine what the federal government has done, even when a state is using a legitimate power at its disposal to do so. Yes, it is legitimate for state governments to tax, but not in such a way that it would undermine the federal government. Why? The means employed by the government of the Union, so the federal government's choice of strategy, are not given by the people of a particular state and not given by the constituents of the legislature which claim the right to tax them, but by the people of all states. Pause here. What does that mean? The strategy that the federal government is using here, a bank, is not is not given by the people of any particular state, but by the people of all the states. We, the people, who created the Constitution in which Congress has the flexibility to choose to create a bank. And that in order for that bank to be created, you needed to hold a vote in Congress where representatives from every single state got a chance to weigh in. And there was enough support nationwide in the Congress to create a bank. And let's say Maryland's representatives voted against the bank. Well, tough. You lost. This is something that is supposed to be done at the national level. So you take the votes of every congressman and senator from across the country, and at that point you can say the nation has spoken and the states must stop. So, what's the practical effect of Maryland's desire to tax the uh, Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States? Well, so, let's start off by remembering that, actually, the tax that was imposed by the Maryland legislature on the Bank of the United States was actually pretty reasonable. It was not as though the Bank of the United States was going to go out of business overnight. But what happens when a judge says it's constitutional for Maryland to do something like that? Marshall's conclusion is the power to tax involves the power to destroy, that the power to destroy may defeat and render useless the power to create. Again, let's interpret this. Marshall is not a libertarian. I'm sure plenty of libertarians think that any tax for any reason in any amount involves a destruction of people's freedom or property, right? And we could debate that if this was a philosophy class, but that is not what Marshall means. What he means is if I give permission to one state to issue a reasonable tax, what I'm effectively doing is telling all the other states that want to jump in on this that they can do it too. And in fact, once I've said that, oh, well, state governments can tax, and they can tax however much they want depending on their state legislature, effectively you're giving states permission to raise the tax so that it is destructive. And that basically means individual states can use their power to tax at any time that they want to defeat and render useless Congress's power to do anything. So we have to recognize that if we, the judges, stay out of the way and let this bad behavior by the states continue, Congress will have no power left. So, or another practical way of thinking of it, the Bank of the United States has branches all over the country, right? So New York and Philadelphia and Richmond, so on and so forth. So the Maryland tax, yes, the Maryland legislature isn't trying to directly tax the branch of the Bank of the United States that's in Philly or New York or Richmond. But by making the Baltimore branch less profitable, that means that you have to rely more on the Bank of United States in New York or Richmond or Philly to be extra profitable, which basically means the increase in costs to the bank is going to be spread nationwide. All the other branches are going to have to cover for the fact that the Maryland branch is going under. What about the opposite, though? Would it be okay if the federal government went after a state chartered bank, a private corporation that a state government uses to handle its transactions, a private bank that is in charge of collecting all state level taxation? Could the federal government do that? Yes, Marshall says. The only requirement in the Constitution is that the taxes of these state banks must be uniform. In other words, you can't say, well, people in New York voted for me in the last election, so I'll tax their state. I will not tax their state bank. But Virginia didn't go my way in the last election, so the president will convince Congress to tax that state bank. That's not uniform. You either have to tax all state banks or none of them. And if you do tax all state banks, the amount must be the same. And why? Why could Congress do that? Because basically you're taxing all of Congress's constituents in every single state. Whereas a single state, Maryland, is trying to render useless something that has been done by a nationwide vote. So here we come again to yet another structuralist argument. And you might remember this because this was the example that I used in last week's lecture on constitutional interpretation. If we apply the principle for which the state of Maryland contends to the Constitution generally, we shall find it capable of changing totally the character of that instrument. In other words, the whole way the Constitution operates will change if we as judges let the state of Maryland do something like this, because we'd be setting the precedent that individual states can, whenever they want, effectively defeat the operation of a federal policy. Or as the way Marshall puts it, we shall find it capable of arresting all the measures of the government. We shall find what Maryland wants to do makes it capable to stop everything the federal government tries to do, right? And the effect of that means the federal government prostrates itself at the foot of the states, right? It has to beg each state to let it act. And that doesn't make any sense. Why? Because the American people have declared their Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, to be supreme, not states, right? And if the states are the ones who are really in charge by being able to set booby traps for the federal government whenever they want, then guess who's really in charge? The supreme power will be exercised by the states and not by we, the people, in creating the U.S. Constitution. So here's the rule to figure out when the federal government can act, when the states can act, but when states must give way to the federal government. The states have no power, by taxation or otherwise, to retard, impede, or in any manner control the operation of the constitutional laws enacted by Congress. In other words, if Congress is acting in a way that is authorized by the Constitution, state governments can't do anything to get in the way of that law being effective. This is, we think, the unavoidable consequence of that supremacy which the Constitution has declared. If you're going to put a phrase in the Constitution that says this Constitution, this national Constitution, and all federal laws made in pursuance of the U.S. Constitution are the supreme law of the land, then any state that tries to get in the way of that becoming true must be declared unconstitutional. Okay, so some specific things to keep in mind as you go back and read and reread and reread the text of this case. So, actually I've focused the most on structuralism. But there are also plenty of other examples of originalism and plain meaning textualism, even pragmatism in his arguments. So go back through and see if you can identify places where Marshall refers to the framers, right? Or says, well, if you just look at a particular word and understand it according to its plain meaning, how people would use it in conversation every day, right? Where's an argument of Marshall making that kind of constitutional interpretation? And then pragmatism is like, well, wait a second. Let's consider the practical consequences of what would happen if the states got to, after they lost a battle in Congress, can still prevent Congress's new program from operating successfully. That creates all sorts of terrible policy consequences, and so judges should be pragmatic. They should realize what they're doing and how it would be disruptive to the country as a whole. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. I hope that if there are other questions I can help answer, that you are asking them. And best of luck. I'll see you next time.